There is a version of you that the people in your life have never met. Not because you are hiding it. Not because it doesn't exist. But because it hasn't emerged yet. Because the conditions for it haven't been created. Because the thinking that would produce it hasn't been practiced. Because the habits that would shape it haven't been built. That version of you is not a fantasy. It is not a dream. It is a psychological possibility. One that becomes real only through a specific kind of change. Not the change that happens on the outside. Not a new haircut, or a new city, or a new relationship, but the kind of change that happens so deep inside you that eventually everything on the outside shifts as a result. This audiobook is about that kind of change. It is about the psychology of becoming unrecognizable. And the first thing you need to understand is what that phrase actually means. Because when most people hear the word unrecognizable, they think of something dramatic. They think of a before and after photo. They think of a sudden awakening, a moment where everything clicks into place and they step out into the world as a completely different person. They imagine transformation as an event, something that happens to you, something fast, something visible. But that is not how it works. That is almost never how it works. Real transformation is not an event. It is a process. And it is a process that is mostly invisible, mostly internal, mostly quiet. You don't become unrecognizable in a single moment. You become unrecognizable across thousands of moments, across decisions made alone, across thoughts you choose not to indulge, across small disciplines that no one else can see. Think about someone in your life who changed, not someone who simply looked different, but someone who genuinely became different. Someone who used to be one way and then, over time, became another way entirely. Someone whose whole energy shifted, whose responses changed, whose priorities rearranged, whose presence felt different in a room. You probably couldn't point to a single moment when that happened. You just noticed, at some point, that they were no longer the same person. The change had already happened by the time you recognized it. That is what this audiobook is exploring. The kind of change that happens so gradually, so quietly, so consistently that by the time it becomes visible to the world, it has already been real for a long time. Now think about yourself. Think about who you are right now. Not who you want to be. Not who you used to be. But who you actually are today. How you respond when things go wrong. How you think when you're alone. What you default to when no one is watching. What patterns repeat in your life? What kind of person shows up when things get uncomfortable? That is your current identity. And your current identity is not fixed. It is not permanent. It is not who you are destined to be forever. It is simply who you have become so far, based on the experiences you've had, the beliefs you absorbed, the habits you repeated, the thinking you practiced, whether intentionally or not. You became who you are, and that means you can become someone else, not by pretending, not by performing, not by forcing some mask onto your face and hoping it sticks, but by genuinely changing the internal structures that create your behavior, by changing how you think, by changing what you believe about yourself, by changing what you do consistently, day after day, when it would be easier to stay the same. That is the psychology of transformation, and that is what this audiobook is about. There is something that pulls at most people when they first encounter this idea. A kind of cautious hope, a quiet voice that says, yes, I want that. But there is another voice too, a louder one that has been there longer, one that says, but you've tried before, you've wanted to change before, and you're still here, aren't you? Still the same? Still repeating the same patterns, still becoming the same version of yourself over and over again. That voice is not your enemy. It is just your history speaking. It is the accumulated weight of every time you set an intention and didn't follow through. Every time you told yourself things would be different and then found yourself back in the same place. That voice is built from evidence. Your own evidence. But evidence from the past does not define what is possible in the future. It only defines what has happened so far, and the reason most people stay the same is not because they lack willpower. It is not because they are weak or lazy or broken. It is because they try to change their behavior without ever changing their identity. They try to do different things while still being the same person, and that is extraordinarily hard, because your behavior is not just a series of choices. It is an expression of who you believe yourself to be. That is the key, and everything in this audiobook builds from that key. You don't become unrecognizable by doing more. You become unrecognizable by becoming different. Internally, fundamentally, at the level of identity itself. And that process begins not with action, it begins with understanding. So let's begin there. Most people want to change. This is not the problem. The desire for change is everywhere. You can see it in the way people talk about their lives, in the plans they make at the start of every new year, in the journals they start and abandon, in the gym memberships that go unused, in the books they buy and never finish, in the conversations they have with themselves at night when the day is over and they're alone with their thoughts. The desire is there, almost universally, almost constantly, and yet most people, by the time they reach the end of their lives, will have remained largely the same fears, the same responses, the same limitations, the same version of themselves, just older. Why? The honest answer is not comfortable, but comfort is not what this audiobook is offering. Understanding is. The first reason most people never change is this: they underestimate how deeply attached they are to who they already are. Identity is not just something you have. It is something you protect, something you defend, something you organize your entire life around without realizing you're doing it. When something threatens your sense of self, your mind does not welcome it. Your mind resists it. Because from a psychological standpoint, losing your identity, even a painful or limiting identity, feels like a kind of death. Think about that for a moment. If you have believed for years that you are someone who struggles with discipline, who never finishes what they start, who always ends up back where they began, that belief has become part of your identity. And when you try to change, part of you doesn't only face the challenge of the new behavior. Part of you faces the threat of losing the story you've been telling about yourself. And the mind, almost automatically, moves to protect that story, not because the story is good, not because it serves you, but because it is familiar, and familiar feels safe, even when it is harmful. This is the first wall that stops most people from changing, not laziness, not weakness, but the unconscious defense of a self-concept they have spent years constructing. The second reason most people never change is comfort, not comfort in the sense of luxury, but comfort in the sense of routine, of predictability, of the known. Your brain is an efficiency machine. It is constantly looking for ways to conserve energy, to automate, to create patterns that can be run without conscious effort. And it does this through habit, through the neural pathways that form when you repeat the same thoughts and behaviors over and over again. These pathways, once formed, become the path of least resistance, your default mode, the direction your life flows when you are not actively redirecting it. And here is the deeply important thing to understand: staying the same requires almost no energy. Changing requires enormous amounts of it, not just physical energy, but psychological energy, attention, conscious effort, the ongoing, often exhausting work of choosing differently when everything in you wants to choose the same. Change is metabolically expensive, and so your brain, without any malice or intention, will always create a pull back toward the familiar, back toward who you have always been. Most people feel that pull and interpret it as a sign, as evidence that the change isn't right for them, that they aren't built for it, that they should stop trying. But the pull is not a sign of wrongness. It is a sign of how deeply the old patterns are embedded. And that is not something to fear. It is something to understand. Because what you understand, you can work with. The third reason most people never change is that they focus on behavior before they address identity. They decide they want to become a disciplined person, so they try to start waking up at 5 in the morning. They decide they want to become financially responsible, so they try to track every expense. They decide they want to become someone who exercises, so they buy new workout clothes and set an alarm. And for a few days, maybe a week, maybe a month, it works. They do the behavior. They follow through. They feel hopeful. And then one morning the alarm goes off and they don't get up, or the tracking feels like too much and they stop, or something disrupts the routine and they don't restart it. And they blame themselves. They call themselves undisciplined, unmotivated, failures. But the failure wasn't a character flaw. The failure was structural, because they were trying to perform a behavior that didn't yet belong to their identity. They were trying to act like a different person while still being the same person inside. A truly disciplined person doesn't have to fight themselves every morning to get up. The behavior has become part of who they are. They do it because it is consistent with their self-image, not because they are white-knuckling their way through willpower. That is the difference, and it is everything. The fourth reason people don't change is that they overestimate what they can do in a short period and underestimate what they can do over a long one. They want the transformation to be fast. They want results in a week, in a month. And when the change doesn't come quickly, they conclude that it isn't coming. They give up right at the point where consistency would have started to compound. Real transformation does not follow the timeline your impatience sets for it. It follows the logic of accumulation, of small things done repeatedly over time, of identity being reshaped not in a single session, but across hundreds and thousands of small moments. The person you become in 5 years of consistent internal change is almost unrecognizable compared to who you are today. But the person you become in 2 weeks of intense effort, followed by abandonment, is mostly just a tired version of who you already were. These are the walls that stop most people. The attachment to the old self, the pull of comfort and routine, the mistake of trying to change behavior without changing identity, and the impatience that leads to quitting before the compounding begins. Understanding these walls is not discouraging. It is clarifying, because once you see them clearly, you can choose to do something different. And that begins with the deepest thing of all, identity. You are not just a person who does things. You are a person who believes things about themselves, and those beliefs, most of which were formed long ago and have been quietly running in the background ever since, determine almost everything about how you live. This is the part of transformation that most people skip. They want to get to the action, the discipline, the habits, the results, but they skip the foundation and then wonder why everything keeps collapsing. The foundation is identity, and understanding identity, really understanding it, is one of the most transformative things you can do. So what is identity exactly? Identity is the story you tell yourself about who you are. It is the collection of beliefs, labels, and self-concepts that you have accumulated across your entire life. It is made up of things people told you when you were young, things you concluded about yourself after certain experiences, things you decided were true about yourself, and then repeated so many times that they became invisible, just assumed facts about who you are. Some of those beliefs are empowering, but many of them are limiting. And the limiting ones are often the most invisible, because they are the oldest, the most deeply embedded, the ones you have rehearsed the most. Here is an example. Think about someone who grew up being told they were not good with money. Maybe a parent said it. Maybe they watched themselves make poor financial decisions as a teenager and drew a conclusion. Maybe they just absorbed the financial anxiety in their home and made it their own. Whatever the origin, at some point they formed a belief. The belief that they are not someone who is good with money. And that belief doesn't just affect their thoughts. It shapes their behavior. Because they see themselves as someone who is not good with money, they spend impulsively, avoid looking at their bank account, make short-term decisions, and then find themselves confirming the belief over and over again. The identity creates the behavior. The behavior confirms the identity, and the cycle continues. This is not a conscious process. This is not someone choosing to be bad with money. This is someone whose behavior is being driven by a deep, mostly unconscious belief about who they are. And this is happening in your life right now. In every area where you feel stuck. In every pattern that keeps repeating. In every version of a situation where you find yourself behaving in ways that don't align with who you want to be. There is an identity beneath that behavior, a belief about who you are, and until that belief changes, the behavior will not change. Not permanently, not sustainably. Your identity is the operating system. Your habits and behaviors are the applications running on top of it. You can update the applications all you want. But if the operating system hasn't changed, you will keep running into the same errors. Now, how does identity form in the first place? It forms through repetition, through experience, through interpretation. When something happens to you, your mind doesn't just record the event. It draws a conclusion. It creates a meaning. And if that meaning is repeated enough, it becomes a belief. And if that belief is held for long enough, it becomes identity. You tried something and failed. Your mind concluded, I'm not good at this. You tried again and failed again. The conclusion strengthened, I'm someone who fails at this. After enough repetitions, the conclusion became identity. I'm just not someone who is good at this. But here is the crucial thing to understand. The conclusions your mind drew were not necessarily accurate. They were interpretations. They were stories your mind created to make sense of what happened. And like all stories, they could have been told differently. The same failure that became, I'm not good at this, could have become, I haven't learned this yet. The same social rejection that became, I'm not likable, could have become, that person and I weren't compatible. The same setback that became, always give up, could have become, I need to develop more persistence. The events were real, but the meaning you assigned to them was a choice. Even if it didn't feel like one, and meaning, repeated enough, becomes identity. This is both unsettling and liberating. Unsettling because it means you have been living inside a story you helped write without fully knowing you were writing it. Liberating because it means the story is not fixed. It can be rewritten, not instantly, not easily, but genuinely, fundamentally. Now let's talk about something called self-image. Self-image is the internal picture you carry of yourself, not the picture you present to others, not the version of yourself you perform in social situations, but the picture that exists in the privacy of your own mind, the one that informs how you feel walking into a room, how you speak to yourself when you make a mistake, how much success you allow yourself to experience before unconsciously pulling back. Your self-image operates like a thermostat. It is set to a certain temperature, and whenever your life moves significantly above or below that temperature, your behavior adjusts to bring it back. This is why people who lose a lot of weight quickly often gain it back. Not because they lack discipline, but because their self-image is still set to the temperature of someone who carries extra weight. And so their behavior, unconsciously, moves to confirm that self-image. This is why people who suddenly experience significant financial success sometimes make decisions that undermine it, not because they are careless, but because their self-image is still set to the temperature of someone who struggles financially. And so they find ways to bring things back to familiar. This is why some people consistently underperform in relationships, even when they deeply want connection. Their self-image is set to the temperature of someone who doesn't deserve lasting love. And so, without fully realizing it, they create the conditions that confirm that belief. The thermostat analogy is uncomfortable because it suggests that you might be unconsciously working against your own goals. And the truth is, You probably are. Not because you want to, but because your self-image is running a program that is older than your current goals, deeper than your conscious intentions, and you can't override the thermostat through sheer effort. You have to change the setting. You have to shift the self-image. You have to begin building a new internal picture of who you are. So how do you do that? You do it through evidence, through experience, through intentional repetition. You begin to take actions that are consistent with the new identity, even small ones. Even ones that feel insignificant, because every time you act in alignment with who you are becoming rather than who you have been, you create a small piece of evidence for the new self-image. And evidence, accumulated over time, shifts the thermostat. It doesn't happen overnight. And it doesn't happen from a single dramatic decision. It happens through the patient, consistent practice of becoming. Think about the word becoming. Not being, not having arrived. Becoming. It is a process, an active, ongoing movement in a direction. Not a destination you reach and stand at forever, but a direction you move in consistently over time. And the direction is shaped by who you are choosing to be. Not who you have been told you are. Not who your history suggests you are, but who you are choosing to become through your thoughts, your actions, your attention, and your daily practice. Identity is not destiny. It is a starting point, and a starting point can always be changed. Let's go deeper into this, because there is another dimension of identity that most people overlook entirely. Your identity is not just individual, it is also social. It is embedded in relationships, in communities, in the roles you play and the labels that have been given to you by others. You are someone's child, someone's friend, someone's colleague, someone's partner. And within each of those relationships, there is an expectation of who you are, an established pattern, a version of you that other people have grown accustomed to. And when you begin to change, those relationships will often push back. Not always with hostility, often with something more subtle. A gentle pulling back to the familiar, a discomfort with the version of you that doesn't quite match the version they know. This is one of the most underestimated challenges of genuine transformation. Not the internal work, not the discipline required, but the social gravity of existing relationships. The way the people around you, even people who love you and want good things for you, will sometimes unconsciously resist your change because your change disrupts the equilibrium they've built their relationship with you around. You may find that as you change, certain relationships become strained, not because the people are bad, but because the dynamic was built around a version of you that no longer quite fits. This is not a reason to avoid changing. It is simply something to be aware of, to hold with compassion rather than resentment, to navigate thoughtfully rather than reactively. Because the alternative, staying the same to preserve a dynamic, is a form of self-abandonment, and self-abandonment, no matter how quietly it is done, accumulates, and it keeps you locked in the identity of someone who sacrifices their own growth for the comfort of others. That is not compassion. That is self-erasure. The most important thing to understand about identity is this: it is not who you are. It is who you have learned to be. And you can learn to be someone different. Not someone fake. Not someone performing a character they don't believe in, but someone more fully aligned with who you actually want to be. Someone whose inner life and outer behavior are finally moving in the same direction. That is not a fantasy. That is the natural result of intentional identity change, and it starts with seeing clearly who you currently are, not with judgment, not with self-criticism, but with honest, open, curious observation. Look at your patterns. Look at the stories you tell about yourself. Look at the behaviors that keep repeating. Look at the self-image you carry. Look at the thermostat setting you've been living inside of. See it all clearly, because you cannot change what you cannot see. And once you see it, something becomes possible that wasn't possible before. The choice to be different. Not someday. Not after everything is perfect. But now, in this moment, in the next thought, in the next action, in the slow, patient, powerful process of choosing consistently who you are becoming. There is a version of you that has served its purpose. Not a version that was bad necessarily. Not a version that deserves to be discarded without acknowledgement. But a version that was built for different circumstances. A version that developed in response to what was. And that version, however much you've identified with it, is not the version you need to carry into what could be. Letting go of your old self is perhaps the most psychologically complex part of transformation, because what you are letting go of is not just habits or behaviors. You are letting go of a story, a sense of self, a familiar architecture that your entire inner world has been built around. And that, even when the architecture is painful, is not a small thing. There is something worth naming here, something that often goes unnamed in conversations about personal change, and that is grief. Yes, grief, even when the old self was limiting, even when it caused you pain, even when you genuinely want to move beyond it. There is a kind of grief in letting it go. Because it was yours, because you built it, because it was what you knew, and the known, no matter how uncomfortable, carries a kind of safety that the unknown never quite does. If you have ever tried to change and felt an unexpected sadness, a heaviness you couldn't explain, this is probably why. Not because the change is wrong, but because change involves loss, and loss, even necessary loss, deserves acknowledgement. So acknowledge it. You don't have to perform some dramatic ritual. You don't have to make your letting go into a spectacle. But you do need to be honest with yourself. You need to look at the old version of you and recognize that it was real, that it served a function, that it made sense given what you knew and what you had experienced. And then, with compassion rather than contempt, you begin the process of release. What does the old self look like for you? It might look like the identity of someone who has always struggled, someone for whom things have never quite come together, someone who starts but doesn't finish, someone who is overlooked, someone who plays it small to avoid the risk of bigger failure. Or it might look like someone who uses business as a shield, someone who keeps moving so they don't have to feel, someone who mistakes intensity for meaning, someone who has built their worth around their productivity. Or it might look like someone who has made their past the defining story of their life, someone who carries an old wound as though it were a badge of identity, someone who has decided, consciously or not, that what happened to them is who they are. None of these identities are evil. All of them made sense at some point. All of them were adaptive. They were strategies, coping mechanisms, ways of surviving what needed to be survived. But survival strategies are not transformation strategies. And at some point, the strategy that helped you survive becomes the thing that keeps you from thriving. Let's talk about the specific mechanisms of holding on. Because most people don't consciously choose to hold on to their old self. It happens automatically, through patterns so ingrained they are invisible. One of the most powerful ways the old self maintains its grip is through the stories you tell about your past. Notice how you narrate your own history. Notice the arc of the story you tell. Notice whether your history is a story of being acted upon, of being limited by forces outside your control, of being someone to whom things happen, or whether it is a story of learning, of growth, of someone who moved through difficulty and emerged with something valuable. Both versions might contain the same events, but they produce entirely different identities. The story you tell about your past is not just a neutral description. It is an active shaping force on who you believe you are today. And if your story consistently positions you as someone who was limited, wounded, disadvantaged, dismissed, those themes will show up in your current behavior. Not because the past determines the future, but because the story you tell about the past determines how you see yourself now. This is not about denying what happened. It is not about pretending pain wasn't real or that unfair things didn't occur. It is about choosing what meaning you carry forward from those experiences, because meaning is always a choice, even when it doesn't feel like one. The second mechanism of holding on is rumination. Rumination is the practice of replaying, of turning thoughts over and over in your mind without moving through them. It is different from reflection. Reflection moves. Reflection processes. Reflection leads somewhere. Rumination circles. It revisits the same emotional territory again and again, keeping the wound fresh, keeping the old self alive. When you ruminate about past failures, you are rehearsing failure. You are strengthening the neural pathways associated with that experience. You are making it more available, more real, more defining. When you ruminate about past betrayals or humiliations, you are rehearsing those emotional states. You are keeping them active in your nervous system. You are living in them, even though they exist only in your memory. Letting go of the old self requires interrupting rumination, not through force, not through suppressing thoughts, but through redirection, through the conscious choice, again and again, to turn your attention toward the person you are becoming rather than the experiences that defined who you were. This is not denial. This is discipline, mental discipline, the kind that slowly, gradually reshapes the landscape of your inner world. The third mechanism of holding on is the way your environment keeps the old self alive. Your environment is filled with cues, physical cues, social cues, cues that continuously activate the old patterns, old feelings, old versions of who you are. The space you live in, the people you spend time with, the media you consume, the conversations you repeatedly have, all of these things are not neutral. They are actively shaping who you are every day, whether you are aware of it or not. Think about what your environment reflects back to you. Think about the version of yourself that your most frequent conversations reinforce. Think about whether the people in your life call forward the person you are becoming or the person you have been. Environments are powerful not because they force you to be a certain way, but because they make certain identities easy and others difficult. They lower or raise the cost of certain behaviors. They make certain thoughts more frequent. And over time, the version of you that fits most naturally into your environment is the version that tends to dominate. This is why changing your environment, even in small ways, can be one of the most effective catalysts for identity change, not because the environment transforms you, but because it stops reinforcing the old self at every turn. You don't have to rebuild your entire life, but you can begin to notice which parts of your environment are pulling you back. And you can make small, deliberate choices to create environments that make the new version of you more available. Now let's talk about something subtler, something that operates beneath the mechanisms of story, rumination, and environment. Something that is perhaps the deepest reason the old self persists. It is this: the old self feels real, and the new self feels hypothetical. When you try to change, you are asking yourself to invest in someone who doesn't fully exist yet, to trust in a version of yourself you can imagine but can't yet feel. And meanwhile, the old self is right here, fully formed, completely familiar, vivid and real in a way the new self simply isn't yet. This gap between the vivid reality of the old self and the hypothetical quality of the new self is one of the most underestimated obstacles in transformation, because you can't feel the new identity the way you feel the old one. Not yet. Not until you've lived in it enough. Not until you've made enough choices from that place. Not until the new patterns are practiced enough to feel natural rather than effortful. And in that gap, doubt lives. The question is not whether doubt will arise. It will. The question is what you do with it. Whether you let doubt be evidence that the change is impossible, or whether you let doubt be simply part of the process, a natural feature of the space between who you have been and who you are becoming. The people who transform are not people who had no doubt. They are people who continued anyway. People who showed up to the practice even when it felt hollow. People who chose the new behavior even when the new identity didn't yet feel real. People who kept building evidence for a self-image that was still mostly a vision, not yet a felt reality. Because here is the truth: the new self becomes real through action. Not through waiting to feel ready. Not through waiting for confidence. Not through waiting until the old self somehow naturally fades. The new self becomes real when you behave as that self, repeatedly, before it fully feels true. That is the mechanism of identity change. Acting your way into being, not performing, not pretending, but genuinely orienting your choices toward the person you are committed to becoming and allowing the identity to solidify through repetition. This is hard. It is genuinely hard. And anyone who tells you it isn't is either lying or hasn't been through it. But hard is not the same as impossible, and it is not the same as not worth it. Because on the other side of letting go of your old self, something remarkable becomes available, something that isn't available while you're still holding on: space, psychological space, identity space, the room to become something genuinely different from what you have been. And in that space, something begins to grow. Not quickly, not dramatically, but consistently. Something that over time becomes undeniable. Something new. Your thoughts are not just passing visitors in your mind. They are architects. They are constantly designing the structure of your inner world. And the structure of your inner world is what produces your experience of life. What you notice, what you feel, what you are drawn toward, what you avoid, how you interpret what happens to you, how you respond to challenge, to failure, to uncertainty. All of that is downstream of how you think. Not the individual thoughts, the random ones that drift through your mind uninvited, but the patterns of thinking, the recurring shapes your thoughts tend to take, the questions you habitually ask yourself, the lens through which you tend to see everything. Rebuilding how you think is not about positive thinking in the shallow sense. It is not about forcing yourself to smile and repeat affirmations you don't believe. That kind of surface-level positivity doesn't rebuild anything. It just pastes a thin layer of optimism over an unchanged structure. What rebuilding your thinking actually requires is something deeper, something more honest, something more rigorous. It requires becoming a thoughtful observer of your own mind. Most people are not observers of their thinking. They are participants in it. They are completely inside it, moved by it, identified with it. When a thought arises, it doesn't feel like something happening in the mind. It feels like reality, like something being perceived rather than created. This is the nature of automatic thinking. It is so fast, so habitual, so familiar that it bypasses conscious awareness entirely. You don't notice you're thinking something. You just experience the emotional consequence of having thought it. You walk into a room and suddenly feel small. You don't consciously think, "I am less than the people in this room." But a version of that thought happened, instantly, automatically, below the threshold of your awareness. And what you experience is the feeling that followed it. You make a mistake and immediately feel worthless. You didn't consciously decide to think, "This mistake proves I am fundamentally inadequate." But a version of that thought happened. And what you feel is the weight of having believed it. The first step in rebuilding how you think is learning to see these automatic patterns, to slow down enough to catch the thoughts that are shaping your feelings before you're even aware they occurred. This is not a dramatic process. It is a quiet one. It is the practice of noticing, of becoming a little more conscious, a little more observational, a little less automatically swept along by whatever your mind generates. You begin to ask yourself, what am I actually thinking right now? Not what do I want to be thinking? Not what is a healthier thought, but what is the actual thought that just happened? What story did my mind just tell? And you observe it, without judgment, ideally, just with honest curiosity, because you cannot change a pattern you cannot see. Now let's talk about the kinds of thinking patterns that tend to keep people stuck. The recurring shapes that limit identity and limit possibility. The first is what you might call all or nothing thinking, the tendency to see things in extremes. Either you're succeeding completely or you're failing entirely. Either you did it perfectly or you may as well not have done it at all. Either you are a disciplined person or you are not. Either you are good at something or you are bad at it. This pattern is extraordinarily destructive in the context of identity change, because transformation is not a straight line, it is messy and uneven. There will be good days and bad days. There will be progress and regression. There will be moments of genuine alignment with the new self and moments of slipping back into the old patterns. And if your thinking is all or nothing, every imperfect moment becomes evidence of total failure. Every setback becomes proof that the change isn't happening. Every bad day confirms that you're still the same person. But that is not an accurate reading of reality. It is a distorted one. A distortion produced by a thinking pattern that sees only two categories where there are many. The person who is becoming does not transform uniformly. They transform unevenly, gradually, imperfectly, with both forward steps and backward ones, and neither the forward steps nor the backward steps alone define who they are becoming. The direction, sustained over time, defines it. All or nothing thinking cannot hold this nuance, and so it needs to be replaced with something more spacious, with a way of thinking that can accommodate the messiness of real transformation. The second thinking pattern worth examining is what might be called permanence thinking, the habit of interpreting temporary states as permanent realities, of feeling stuck and concluding you will always be stuck, of struggling and concluding that struggle is your destiny, of failing and deciding that failure is your nature. This pattern is particularly insidious because it takes real, present, moment experience and projects it into an imagined forever. It turns a current difficulty into a permanent condition, and a mind that believes something is permanent stops trying to change it. Why would you put effort into changing something you've already decided can't be changed? Permanence thinking quietly removes effort from the equation. And without effort, without the consistent action of choosing differently, nothing changes, which then seems to confirm the belief that things are permanent. This is another cycle, another loop that keeps the old identity in place. Breaking it requires cultivating what might be called temporal awareness, the recognition that states are temporary, that where you are right now is not where you will always be, that the fact something has been true for a long time does not mean it will always be true. You have changed before, maybe not in the ways you wanted, maybe not intentionally. But you are not the same person you were 10 years ago, not the same person you were 5 years ago. You are already different, already transformed, at least somewhat, by time and experience. If you can change without trying, imagine what you can do with intention. The third thinking pattern to examine is scarcity thinking, the belief that there is not enough time, not enough opportunity, not enough capability in you, not enough support, not enough room for both you and others to succeed. Scarcity thinking keeps you small. It makes you defensive rather than curious, closed rather than open. It makes you hold tightly to what you have rather than reaching for what you want. It makes every risk feel like it could be the loss of the little that you currently have. And scarcity is often not a reflection of actual circumstances. It is a lens, a way of interpreting circumstances that is shaped by identity, by history, by a self-image that has been set to a low thermostat. Moving out of scarcity thinking doesn't mean becoming naively optimistic. It means developing the capacity to hold possibility alongside reality, to see both what is and what could be, to make decisions from a place of potential rather than a place of deprivation. And this shift from scarcity to possibility is one of the most transformative cognitive changes you can make, because it changes what you reach for, what you attempt, what you allow yourself to want. Now let's talk about what you replace these patterns with, because noticing is necessary. But noticing alone doesn't rebuild the architecture. What rebuilds it is new questions. Your mind is, at its core, a question-answering machine. Whatever questions you habitually ask yourself, your mind will work to answer. And the answers your mind generates shape your beliefs, your emotions, and your behavior. Most people ask themselves limiting questions without realizing it. Why does this always happen to me? Why can't I get this right? What's wrong with me? Why do I keep failing? Your mind will answer these questions, and the answers will be limiting. Because the questions themselves point toward limitation, toward failure, toward something being fundamentally wrong. But what if the questions changed? What if instead of why does this always happen to me, the question became what can I learn from this? Instead of why can't I get this right, the question became what would help me improve? Instead of what's wrong with me, the question became what would I do if I believed I could? These are not just nicer questions. They are fundamentally different questions. They point your mind in a different direction. And a mind pointed in a different direction will find different things, will generate different answers, will produce a different experience. The practice of asking better questions is deceptively simple and extraordinarily powerful, because you are not forcing a positive conclusion. You are simply redirecting where the mind's searching goes. And over time, the things your mind searches for and finds begin to reshape what feels true, what seems possible, who you believe yourself to be. Let's go a little further into the nature of thought and its relationship to identity. Your thoughts are not random. They follow grooves. They flow along channels that have been worn into your mind by repetition. Every thought you have repeated many times has deepened its own groove, made itself more automatic, more effortlessly available, more likely to arise again. This is the physiological reality of thinking. Neural pathways that are used frequently become stronger, faster, more automatic. Neural pathways that are rarely used weaken over time. Your habitual thoughts are literally structuring your brain. They are creating the hardware of your perception and your identity. And this means that changing how you think is not just a psychological project. It is a biological one. You are, through the deliberate practice of new thought patterns, literally reshaping the physical structure of your brain. This does not happen quickly. It happens through repetition, through the patient, consistent practice of redirecting, of catching the old thought and choosing a different one, not once, not 10 times, but hundreds of times, thousands of times, until the new groove becomes deeper than the old one, until the new pattern becomes more automatic than the old. This is the work. It is not glamorous. It does not produce immediate results. It does not feel transformative in any individual moment, but across time, it is the most transformative thing you can do. Because when you change how you think, you change what you see. When you change what you see, you change what you do. When you change what you do, you change who you are. Thought by thought, pattern by pattern, day by day, there is another dimension of rebuilding your thinking that goes beyond the patterns themselves, and that is the quality of your attention. Most people's attention is scattered, pulled in dozens of directions simultaneously, caught between what was and what might be, rarely fully present to what actually is. And scattered attention produces scattered thinking. It produces a mind that is reactive rather than intentional, that responds to whatever stimulus is most urgent rather than what is most important, that is led by the outside world rather than directed from the inside. Rebuilding how you think requires developing the capacity for intentional attention, the ability to choose consciously where your mind goes, not to control every thought. That is impossible and also unnecessary, but to develop a greater degree of agency over where your sustained attention lies. Because where attention goes, energy flows. And where energy flows, growth happens. When you consistently direct your attention toward possibility, toward learning, toward the person you are becoming, you are not just thinking pleasant thoughts. You are actively nourishing the new identity. You are giving it the attention and energy it needs to become more real, more solid, more you. And simultaneously, every time you choose to redirect attention away from the old patterns, the old stories, the old limitations, you are quietly starving the old identity, not dramatically cutting it off, but slowly withdrawing the attention and energy that kept it vivid and real. This is how the old self fades, not through force, not through dramatic rejection, but through the gradual withdrawal of the attention and energy that sustained it. And this is how the new self grows, not through wishes, not through declarations, but through the patient, consistent investment of your attention and your thought in who you are choosing to become. One thought at a time, one redirection at a time, one deliberately chosen question at a time, until one day the new patterns are deeper than the old ones, until the new thoughts arise more easily than the old ones, until the new self is no longer an effort but a nature. That is the destination, and the path to it is thought. There is a quiet truth that transformation depends on, a truth that is simple enough to state and difficult enough to live that most people bypass it entirely. The truth is this: you become what you do consistently, not what you do occasionally, not what you do intensely for a short period, not what you do when you're feeling motivated and inspired and aligned, but what you do consistently, day after day, regardless of how you feel, regardless of whether it seems to be working, regardless of whether anyone is watching or encouraging or applauding. Consistency is the mechanism of transformation. It is the process through which small actions compound into identity, through which tiny shifts in behavior, repeated enough, become the fundamental nature of a person. And yet consistency is also the thing that most people find most difficult. Not because they lack the capacity for it, but because they misunderstand what it requires. Most people think consistency requires constant motivation, constant inspiration, a sustained emotional commitment that carries them forward without effort. And when the emotion fades, as it always does, they interpret its absence as a sign that something has gone wrong, that they've lost it, that the change isn't real. But consistency has very little to do with emotion. Motivation is a feeling, and feelings by their nature fluctuate. They rise and fall with circumstances, with energy levels, with sleep, with 1,000 variables that have nothing to do with your actual commitment to change. The person who only shows up when they feel motivated will show up some of the time, and showing up some of the time produces very little compound growth. The person who shows up regardless of how they feel, who has built showing up into the structure of their days, rather than the uncertainty of their moods, will show up almost all of the time, and showing up almost all of the time produces transformation. This is the distinction between motivation and discipline, between wanting and doing, between intending and becoming. Discipline is not about being hard on yourself. It is not about punishment or denial or forcing yourself through pain. At its core, discipline is simply the act of doing what you decided to do, even when the feeling that drove the decision has temporarily subsided. It is honoring your future self over your present comfort. And that, practiced consistently, is one of the most identity-shifting things you can do. Because every time you show up when you don't feel like it, every time you follow through when it would be easier not to, you are building evidence. Evidence that you are someone who follows through. Evidence that you are someone whose word to themselves means something. Evidence that you are someone who can be trusted by themselves. And that evidence, accumulated over hundreds of repetitions, becomes identity. Let's talk about the nature of habit. Because habits are the infrastructure of consistency. They are the mechanism through which behavior becomes automatic, through which action becomes identity. A habit is a behavior that has been repeated enough times that it requires very little conscious effort. The decision has been made in advance. The pathway has been carved deep enough that traveling it doesn't require navigation anymore. It just happens. Think about the habits you currently have, the ones that require no thought. the ones you simply do. Brushing your teeth, making coffee, checking your phone, driving a familiar route. These things happen largely on autopilot because they have been practiced enough times to become automatic. Now imagine your new behaviors, your new thought patterns, your new disciplines becoming that automatic. Imagine waking up and moving toward growth, not because you've summoned the will to do so, but because it's simply what you do. Because it's who you are. That is the end state of consistent practice, not effort, automaticity, identity. But getting from effortful choice to automatic identity requires a long, gradual period of deliberate repetition. And in that period, it often doesn't feel like it's working. This is one of the most important things to understand about consistency. It often doesn't feel like it's working. The changes happening inside you, in your neural pathways, in your self-image, in your internal thermostat setting, are below the threshold of what you can consciously perceive on a day-to-day basis. You are changing, but you can't see the change yet, because the change is being built at the microscopic level, in the accumulation of tiny increments that individually seem meaningless. This is the zone where most people quit. They've been doing the work. They've been showing up. They've been trying to think differently, to behave differently, to practice the new identity. And they look at themselves and see no visible change. They feel essentially the same. And they conclude that it isn't working. But the conclusion is premature, because they are standing inside the gap between when the change begins and when it becomes perceptible. And the gap is not a sign of failure. It is a natural feature of any compound growth process. Think about a seed planted underground. In the first days after planting, there is no visible evidence that anything is happening. If you didn't know better, you might conclude that the seed is dead, that nothing is growing, that the planting was futile. But beneath the surface, everything is happening. The seed is opening, roots are forming, energy is accumulating. The entire infrastructure for growth is being built in the invisible dark. And then, one day, a shoot breaks the surface, and it was never really sudden. It just became visible. That is the nature of consistent practice applied to identity change. You build in the invisible dark for longer than feels comfortable. And then, one day, something becomes visible. And another thing. And then more. Not all at once. Not in a dramatic reveal. But incrementally, quietly, the results of what you've been building begin to appear. The key is to stay in the process long enough for the invisible to become visible. And that requires a kind of faith. Not blind faith, but reasoned faith. The understanding that compound growth is real. That what you do consistently accumulates. That the person you are becoming through daily practice is genuinely taking shape, even when you can't yet see the shape. Now let's talk about something that consistency must coexist with imperfection. One of the most self-defeating beliefs about consistency is the belief that it means perfect. That if you miss a day, break a habit, slip back into an old pattern, the streak is broken, the progress is lost, and you might as well start over. This belief is not just wrong. It is actively harmful, because it creates a relationship with consistency that cannot survive contact with real life. Real life will interrupt. Real life will throw unexpected circumstances at you. Real life will present days where the discipline breaks down, where the old patterns reassert themselves, where you find yourself having done the thing you were trying to stop doing, or having not done the thing you were trying to build. That will happen, not occasionally, frequently. And the question is not whether it will happen. The question is what you do when it does, because how you respond to imperfection is actually more defining of your identity than the imperfection itself. The person who slips back into an old behavior and decides they've failed, who quits the practice entirely because they broke the perfect streak, is training themselves to be fragile. They are building an identity that cannot survive imperfection, which means they are building an identity that cannot survive real life. But the person who slips back into an old behavior and gently, without drama, returns to the practice the next day, is training something completely different. They are training resilience. They are building an identity that understands progress as a long-term direction rather than a perfect daily record. They are developing a relationship with consistency that can actually survive the inevitable disruptions of a real human life. Missing a day doesn't erase the work you've done. Slipping into an old pattern doesn't destroy the new one you've been building. What matters is the ratio, the overall direction, the long arc of what you do consistently, not the occasional detour. And the person who understands this is someone who can actually stay in the process long enough for it to work. There is one more dimension of consistency that deserves attention, and that is the relationship between consistency and identity confirmation. Every time you follow through on a commitment to yourself, you are not just doing the behavior. You are casting a vote for who you are. You are creating a piece of evidence that says, I am someone who does this. An identity is built from evidence. Your own evidence, the accumulated record of what you have actually done. When that record says, over and over again, that you show up for yourself, that you follow through, that you choose the harder right thing over the easier comfortable thing, your self-image begins to reorganize around that evidence. You stop seeing yourself as someone who tries and fails. You start seeing yourself as someone who does, someone who commits, someone who can be counted on, at least by yourself. And that shift in self-image is transformative, because self-image determines behavior, and behavior produces results. And results reshape the world around you in response to who you are becoming. This is the compounding of consistency. Not just the compounding of behavior, the compounding of identity. You become more yourself, more genuinely, deeply yourself in the direction you have chosen, until the person doing the work and the person who you believe yourself to be are no longer two different things. Until you are simply who you have become, thought by thought, action by action, day by day. No one announces that they are transforming, or rather, the people who announce it loudest are often the ones who transform the least. The declaration creates a kind of psychological release, the feeling of having already done something by saying you intend to do it. And that release can reduce the actual urgency to follow through. Genuine transformation tends to be quieter than that. It happens in the decisions you make alone, in the conversations you don't have because you've outgrown the need for them, in the reactions you choose not to have, in the thoughts you redirect before they spiral, in the things you begin to want that you didn't want before, in the things that begin to matter less that once felt urgent. You don't become a different person in a single conversation or in a single moment of insight. You become a different person in the accumulation of 1,000 quiet choices, 1,000 moments where you chose the new self over the old one, without applause, without recognition, without even full certainty that it was adding up to anything. And then one day, something small happens. A situation that would have unraveled you 6 months ago barely stirs you. A challenge that would have confirmed your worst fears about yourself instead becomes something you move through with a kind of calm competence you didn't know you had. And you notice, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, private recognition, something has changed. This is the experience of becoming different quietly. It is not a moment of triumph. It is more subtle than that, more intimate. The quiet discovery that the person responding to this moment is not quite the same person who would have responded to it before. There is something important about the quietness of this process that goes beyond temperament or personality. The quietness is actually functional. It is what allows the transformation to be genuine rather than performative. When you transform publicly, when you make your change into a story you tell others, you create a kind of social contract around the identity you're claiming. And social contracts can be motivating. But they can also become performances. You start doing the things associated with the new identity because you've announced it, because others are watching, Because your social self is now invested in the narrative, and behavior driven by social performance is fragile. It depends on the audience. It requires maintenance in a way that behavior driven by genuine internal change does not. The quietest transformations tend to be the most durable, not because they are unseen, but because they are driven from the inside. Because they happened for you, not for the watching eyes of others. Let's talk about what becoming different quietly actually looks like in practice. It looks like choosing not to engage in a conversation that you would have previously jumped into. Not because you've become passive, but because you no longer need what that conversation was offering. The validation, the drama, the feeling of being right. It looks like saying no to something that would have previously felt impossible to refuse. Not dramatically, not with a lengthy explanation. Just cleanly, quietly, with the ease of someone who knows what they want and what they don't. It looks like not needing to talk about how much you've changed, because people who have genuinely changed are usually more interested in the next phase of growth than in the story of their past transformation. It looks like your reactions slowing down, not becoming flat or emotionless, but becoming more considered, more chosen. There is a space between what happens and how you respond, and that space, almost imperceptibly, has grown wider. It looks like a growing comfort with your own company, with silence, with the internal world you have been gradually constructing through all the quiet work. It looks like caring less about things that once felt urgent and caring more about things that once felt distant. Your priorities have quietly rearranged themselves. Not dramatically, but undeniably. These are the signs of genuine internal change. They are not the kind of change that appears in a highlight reel. They are not the kind that gets applause. They are quieter and more real than that. And here is something that is worth sitting with for a moment. The people in your life may not acknowledge the change. In fact, some of them may actively resist recognizing it, because, as we touched on earlier, your change disrupts their established understanding of who you are. And disruption, even of something outgrown, tends to produce resistance. You may change and find that the people closest to you still treat you as the old version, still respond to you based on the patterns they've come to expect, still seem to not see what you can now quietly feel is different. This can be discouraging. It can make you doubt the change. It can pull at you in the direction of the old self, because the old self, at least, had a clear social reality around it. But the change is real regardless of whether it is recognized. Other people's perception of you is always a lag. It comes after the reality. They see you through the lens of who you have been because that is the evidence they have accumulated. The new evidence is still being gathered. The new patterns are still becoming visible. And until they are visible enough and sustained enough, many people will continue to respond to the version of you they know. This is not a reason to give up. It is not a reason to perform the change more dramatically so they can see it. It is simply a feature of the gap between internal change and its external recognition. Stay with the change. Let it become undeniable, not through announcement, but through the sustained reality of who you are becoming. Let the evidence accumulate until even those who most want to see the old you can no longer find them. Because the quiet transformation, the one that happens below the surface and isn't announced and doesn't need applause, is the one that lasts. It is the one that becomes genuinely who you are, not a version you perform, not a change you maintain through effort, but a new nature, a new way of being, a new self that has slowly, quietly, unmistakably become real. When real transformation happens, it is not always what you expected. You may have imagined it would feel like constant happiness, or confidence, or the disappearance of all the old fears and uncertainties. You may have imagined that becoming a different person would mean never again feeling the weight of the things you used to struggle with. But that is not quite what true transformation produces. True transformation produces something quieter, more stable, more durable than happiness, which is a feeling, and feelings fluctuate, more solid than confidence, which can rise and fall with circumstances, more nuanced than the disappearance of difficulty, because difficulty is part of life regardless of who you become. What true transformation produces is a different relationship with your own experience. Not the absence of difficulty, but a different capacity to meet it. Not the end of fear, but a different response to it. Not the absence of old patterns surfacing, but a different speed of recognizing them and a different ease in redirecting. You are still human. You are still subject to the full range of human experience, but the person experiencing that range has changed. And so the experience itself is different. Think about how differently the same situation can be experienced by two different people. The same unexpected change at work, the same conflict in a relationship, the same financial uncertainty, the same criticism from someone whose opinion matters. Two people facing the identical situation can have completely different internal experiences of it, not because the situation is different, but because who they are when they face it is different. That is what transformation changes. Not the circumstances, but the person meeting the circumstances. And because the person meeting the circumstances is different, the response to those circumstances is different. The choices made are different. The patterns set in motion are different. And so over time, the actual outcomes of life begin to shift. Not because luck changed, not because the world suddenly became more accommodating, but because a different person making different choices consistently produces different results. This is the downstream effect of identity change. It is not instant, it is not always dramatic, but it is real, and it compounds, just like the practice that produced it. Let's talk about what shifts in a person's life when they have genuinely changed at the level of identity. The first shift is in what they attract and what they are attracted to. Your identity, your beliefs about yourself, what you feel you deserve, what you feel you are capable of, is constantly shaping what you reach for in life. The opportunities you pursue, the relationships you seek, the standards you hold for yourself, the quality of what you accept. When your identity changes, these things change with it. You begin to reach for things that previously felt out of reach, not because the external opportunity changed, but because the internal sense of what you are capable of and deserve changed. You begin to notice different things, to be drawn to different possibilities, to feel aligned with a different quality of experience, not because the world changed, but because the lens through which you see the world changed, and a different lens reveals different things. The second shift is in your relationships. As you change, the relationships in your life will reorganize around the new version of you. Some relationships will deepen. The people who were always drawn to something real in you, to the potential they could see even when you couldn't, will find that the reality now matches what they sensed. Some relationships will fade, not necessarily through conflict, but through the natural divergence that happens when two people are moving in genuinely different directions. The things that once connected you, the shared stories of limitation, the mutual comfort of staying small, no longer fit the same way. And without that fit, the relationship quietly loses its momentum, and some new relationships will begin. People you would never have met, or met but not connected with, because the version of you that exists now has a different quality, a different energy, a different kind of attention and presence. This reorganization of relationships is one of the most poignant and sometimes painful aspects of transformation. Because you may lose people you cared about, not because they are bad or you are better, but because growth inevitably changes the social landscape around you. And simultaneously, it is one of the most beautiful aspects, because the relationships that form on the other side of your transformation are relationships with someone who is genuinely, fully showing up, not performing, not contracted by fear, but present and real and actually there. The third shift is in your relationship with time. When you live from an old, limiting identity, time often feels like something that is happening to you. Days pass, years accumulate, and you feel the weight of how much time has gone by without the change you wanted. Time is an adversary, or at best, an indifferent force that neither helps nor hinders. But when you are genuinely in the process of transformation, when you have committed to consistent change and are actually living it, your relationship with time shifts. Time becomes something you are actively using. Each day has a different quality, not necessarily more exciting, not free from difficulty, but more intentional, more directed. And you begin to feel the accumulation in a way that is encouraging rather than discouraging. Each day you practice, you know you are adding to something real. Each choice made in alignment with the new self is another brick, and the structure being built is your identity. Your life. Time becomes less of something to be endured and more of something to be lived purposefully. The fourth shift is in your inner silence. The mind of someone locked in an old, painful identity is rarely quiet. It is filled with the noise of rumination, of self-criticism, of the continuous rehearsal of fear and limitation. The volume of that internal noise is one of the great, unspoken burdens of a life that hasn't been examined and changed. As you transform, as you rebuild how you think and practice new patterns of self-perception, the noise gradually quiets, not completely, not perfectly, but measurably, noticeably. There is more inner space, more quiet, more of the experience of simply being, rather than constantly running the anxious program of who you are supposed to be and all the ways you're falling short. This inner silence is not emptiness. It is groundedness. It is the sense of standing on solid ground inside yourself rather than on shifting sand. It is the experience of a self that has been built deliberately and therefore does not require constant, anxious maintenance. It is perhaps the most underrated gift of genuine transformation, not the external results, not the recognition, not the achievements, but the quiet. The quiet of a mind that no longer has to fight itself to function. And from that quiet, something else becomes possible that is difficult to describe but unmistakable when you experience it. A sense of clarity about who you are and what you want. Not the anxious, second-guessing clarity of someone who is perpetually trying to figure out who they should be, but a calm, grounded knowing, a sense of direction that isn't constantly undermined by doubt or distracted by the opinions of others. This is the experience of living from a stable identity, an identity built not by accident, not by the slow accumulation of other people's expectations and your own fears, but by deliberate, consistent, intentional choice. And it changes everything, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, profoundly, in every moment, in every interaction, in every choice. Because who you are always determines how you live, and when who you are genuinely changes, how you live cannot help but change with it. Through the psychology of identity, through the mechanisms that keep people the same, through the process of releasing the old self and building the new one, through the nature of thought and how it shapes who you are, through the quiet, persistent work of consistency, through the gradual emergence of someone genuinely different. And now, at the end, there is something important to say. You don't need to have it all figured out today. The path doesn't require you to see the whole staircase. It only requires that you see the next step and then take it, and then look for the one after that. Transformation is not a plan you execute perfectly. It is a direction you commit to honestly, a commitment you renew every day, not because you feel certain or inspired, but because you have decided somewhere quiet and deep inside yourself that who you have been is no longer the full story of who you are. The work we have explored in this audiobook is not glamorous. It will not always feel meaningful in the moment. There will be days when the practice feels hollow and the old self feels louder than ever. There will be moments where you look at yourself and see no visible evidence of change and wonder if you are simply deceiving yourself. In those moments, remember this. The seed does not see its own roots forming. The ember does not feel itself building toward flame. The person in the midst of genuine change rarely has the perspective to see the full shape of what they are becoming. Because they are inside the process, not observing it from the outside. Trust the process even when you can't see its progress. Continue even when continuation feels like an act of faith rather than certainty. Because transformation is exactly that, an act of faith, grounded in action. The faith that what you do consistently, over time, with intention, is actually shaping someone, is actually producing something, is actually becoming real. And it is. Even now, even in this moment, having listened to these words, something has shifted, perhaps subtly, perhaps in a way you can't quite name yet. Awareness has expanded slightly. Something has been named that was previously only felt. A new thought has been thought. A new way of seeing yourself has been briefly touched. That is not nothing. That is how it begins, not in a dramatic moment of total transformation, but in a slight widening of awareness, in a single thought chosen more carefully, in a single moment of recognizing the old pattern before it fully takes hold, in a single day where you choose, quietly, to be slightly more aligned with who you are becoming. Do that today, and then do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, not perfectly, not with constant enthusiasm, but honestly, consistently, with compassion for the imperfection that is guaranteed to accompany the process. Because here is the truth that this audiobook has been building toward from the very beginning. You don't become unrecognizable by trying to change everything at once. You don't become unrecognizable through a single awakening. You don't become unrecognizable by performing a new version of yourself until it sticks. You become unrecognizable the way a river reshapes a landscape, not through force, not through speed, but through the patient, persistent, consistent movement of water over stone, thought by thought, choice by choice, day by day, until one morning you wake up and respond to something in a way that surprises even you, until you catch yourself thinking something that the old version of you never would have thought, until someone who hasn't seen you in a while looks at you and says something has changed, until you look in the mirror, not at your face, but at who is looking back, and recognize a steadiness, a groundedness, a quiet confidence that wasn't there before. That is the moment, not the destination, but a moment in the ongoing movement of a life that is genuinely changing. You are not becoming someone new overnight. You are becoming someone new slowly, thought by thought, action by action, day by day, and you have already begun.